Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alex Money, and I'm part of the Oxford Smith School. Thanks very much for spending the hottest afternoon in Oxford's history with us in here. I'm sure it will be massively worth it. So it's my pleasure to introduce this panel. You don't need me to tell you generically why the agricultural sector is so important to this net zero transition. Generically, it accounts for 8.5% of emissions, another 14.5% if land use changes, deforestation in particular, are taken into account. But this panel is not about generics, it's about specifics. And really, we've got an embarrassment of Michaels, I can say, on this panel, and one Azamat, just to give us some diversity, even if we're not doing it on gender today. But what we're going to be able to do in this session is a bit of a journey, starting with thinking about the supply chain, but thinking about the supply chain in specifics, thinking about stress testing, thinking about the detail that can and needs to be done if these transitions are actually to have traction. So we're going to start there with Professor Michael Obersteiner, and then we'll move from there into understanding both the consumer and producer dynamics involved in agriculture in this transition. And I'm really pleased to say we've got Dr. Mike Clark, who will be talking about some of his current and really exciting research, thinking about some of the consumer-facing dimensions of food systems transitions. And from there, the rubber really hits the road, where we move to Azamat from Ivy Farm. So this will focus really on the level of innovation that's actually happening in practice within the sector to make these things actually happen. And we'll conclude with some perspectives from Dr. Michael Urban, and Michael of Lombard Odier has a particular interest in sustainable food systems and these transitions, and will share with us some of the things that are going on within his firm to that regard. We're going to change it up a little bit in terms of the format. So rather than have you guys wait for an hour before you can say anything, which is painful for everyone probably, I'm inviting each speaker to talk for circa 10 minutes, something like that. And then after that piece, there'll be about 5 minutes for some direct reflections from yourselves on that session. And then we'll have a longer interlude a little bit later on for a bit more of a kind of, I'm going to say meatier, but I don't know if that's the right word in this panel, a more engaged discussion. So that's the plan. But because we're doing it in a particularly complicated way, which the guys at the back probably aren't really thanking me for, but thanks for accommodating that, I'll be quite strict on timekeeping. So if I may, gents, you'll each have a 15-minute session. If you could leave a few minutes within that to get some reflections from the audience, that would be perfect. So with all that said, let's get going. And if I may hand the floor to Professor Michael Obersteiner, and you have the control. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. I want to talk first about kind of the macro picture of the zero net transition, but we actually have two zero net transitions in the agriculture sector. One is the transition to net zero greenhouse gases, but we also have a transition to net zero biodiversity. And in fact, this university has a kind of science-based target to 2035, both on net zero greenhouse and biodiversity. And here you basically have the picture of those two ambitions. And for many of you, you know the greenhouse gas one, where you actually see the business as usual tunnel, and then what's currently pledged and what the real ambition is. And as you see, the ambition gap is still incredibly high, even after many successful COPs following the Paris Agreement. And when you look at the biodiversity picture, it looks, of course, much more bleak. But let me first give you a little bit of an elevator speech on the importance of the food sector, because it's really a giant, and it's a giant at risk. And the first kind of argument is it's a huge economic sector, not agriculture by itself, it's tiny, but the food system is incredibly large. And there are estimates that the food and nature sector, even if you take packaging in and so forth, it's about 50% of GDP. And there's one serious calculation for France, which is an advanced OECD country. The food sector actually makes up something like 36% of GDP. So, it's all the French cheeses and the expensive wines and so forth. So it's really significant, and many people don't know, because agriculture is typically, the farmer and the poor man's kind of economy. At the same time, it's for sure the largest employer. We estimate that there are about 1 billion farmers. Some estimates are lower, and I put into brackets 2.5 billion. These are then when you take into account the household dependents. So you have purely, this is the agricultural definition, 2.5 billion just in agriculture. And, when you talk about the transition to net zero, it's very easy to transition the 10,000 largest power plants in the world to a net zero technology. With 1 billion farmers, it's probably a little more daunting. At the same time, you also have all of these other not nice things associated with it. For example, largest source of child labor. Then, when we look at the greenhouse gas budgets, we have this 1/4 of total greenhouse gas emissions. If you take the food system definition, we are up to 37%. So that's really significant. And what Miles this morning was mentioning, we're only talking about the anthropogenic emissions, but if you have the negative emissions that the forests of the world actually absorb, it's significant amounts, and I put them there. And then, of course, it's the single largest driver of biodiversity decline, basically through land use changes. And when you look at this other figure, I just got this yesterday from the latest report of the WEF. When you look at what are the largest risks in the world, you see climate action failure, extreme weather, biodiversity loss, and so forth. It's all associated with these large numbers. So it's a giant at risk. Let me very shortly talk about these other transition. It's very similar to what we have on the greenhouse gases. The only difference is here that we are also looking at conservation actions. And this is also something we have in the energy sector, as you want. I want to transition then later into a case study of stress testing. And stress testing, we typically, at least me in my academic bubble, we actually start with the bigger picture, with global scenarios. And here I just put up a slide of different global biodiversity targets and different wedges in order to get there. But we have the same thing also mirrored on the energy side, but most of you might actually have seen this kind of analysis. So basically what we do is we have these scenario storylines, then we go into land use modeling, very specifically then in the agricultural sector, looking at food security issues. Then we go into the greenhouse gas budgets, the biodiversity models and so forth, and in the end we come up with geospatial predictions on where these net zero actions will actually happen. And about 4 years ago, we started a project with Vivid Economics where we were asked to do sector-level stress testing for the land use and agricultural sector. And I said, this is fun, but this is not a challenge big enough for an accomplished academic like we are. So we said, I want to go for asset level stress testing, basically using these very large-scale global scenarios, but using them in order to stress test really locations. And so I convinced the project partners that we are going for it, and here you will see some of the results. So basically what we did is we tried to understand how can we get really the transition risks quantified on a kind of production unit level and come up with a stress testing methodology and actually demonstrate the possibility and implementability in terms of the data sets. So where we started was basically satellite images, and what you see here is a satellite image where at what point in time palm plantations came in and replaced virgin forests. And what's beautiful with this is you actually have a time series, so you actually know the age of the palm, and the age of the palm is very important to make the yield predictions. So you can actually, with this information, you have a very good proxy of what this area produces in terms of fresh fruit bunches, which are then pressed and you get the oil out. Then what we also demonstrated there is what you can do already today is you can use information from the satellite images where you actually see then palm trees which are under-fertilized, for example, and you can actually look at improvement investments in order to increase yields and thereby also reduce the land footprint and avoid deforestation elsewhere. But what you can also do is there are providers out there who give you commodity price forecasting given different policy options and so forth. What you also have is, which was quite surprising, it was not very difficult to get, is you get actually the location of all of the mills. And what you also get in addition is you actually get the type of technology and the age of the mill. And what you can use then is you use engineering costing models in order to approximate the current profitability of these production units integrated with the palm plantations you have seen before. And then what you can also, from the patch size, you can infer whether it's actually an industrial plantation owner or it's a small scale farmer. What you can also do, and this is then important for the net zero pathways, you can look at all of the different technological options these mills have in order to reduce the greenhouse gas budget. So in our case, we went into composting of the fresh fruit bunches or some of the basically biomass waste all the way to gasification and carbon capture and sequestration. So, and with this associated also the investments problem and the cost calculations. So basic plain engineering economics. And then what we also found out, we hired a specific specialized company where we not only know the location of the producer, but we also know who is owning it. And so we can actually then link the ownership to the production assets. And of course, some of these larger owners, like this family there, they operate in many different ones. So you can actually construct the portfolio optimization problem, if you want, of those. And then what you basically do is you take these macro scenarios which we had before, you take out the palm oil sector, look at the price forecasts from there, and you combine it with, in this case, we had carbon price scenarios, but we also had, for example, import regulation to the European Union, that a certain type of deforestation associated palm oil was not allowed to be imported into Europe, for example, or China. And we had these different scenario assumptions. And then, of course, you would see then these profit distribution really shifting right or left, depending on what the assumptions were. And so here what we did is we did the asset level, so individual plant economic assessment, but then also looked at the portfolio optimization problem for the holding companies. And then we only got not full coverage, but for some of them, we also knew then or got hold of the data which banks are involved and could pass this information then on to certain banks, mostly agricultural development banks there. Good. So here we were super happy that we actually demonstrated that even 4 years ago, we could actually really go and come up with realistic stress testing in a unlikely geography like Indonesia, where you can get the hold of all of these data sets, that you can demonstrate we can do this now. And 4 years later, I'm still puzzled why we are not all doing this. And with this, I pass on to the next Michael.
Michael, thank you very much for that. And expertly managed within the time. I've actually got lots of questions, but let me just open it up to the room. Any questions, initial responses to that presentation? Yes, please. Thank you.
We actually had no contact to the Indonesian banks, but we presented it to some of our, Western banks, and they actually were really surprised that we have this capability, and for us it was almost a bet when we started this project, where we said, no, we can actually do this, and what was also part of the journey, what was really interesting, was that there are specialized companies, which, as an academic, I didn't know, who gather much of that information. So who is really scared are some of the producer companies and the consumer goods companies, because with this, we know we can expose almost anyone. Because we do the very similar stuff for Brazil on soy, cattle, and so forth. So you can attack every supply chain if you want, even shipping if you want, and do these kind of calculations. And it's possible today. Yeah.
Finance that will enable the producers
yes.
to make the shift, and that seems to be a real struggle, particularly in Indonesia on palm.
Oh, yeah. No, for sure. I think what we really need is we need to have a proper stress testing methodology that actually comes in as a regulation. Then people will really wake up. And here, this is just a demonstration on how you would do a forward-looking stress testing with these environmental consequences. And it's, it's baby steps. There are lots of standardization needed. But it's a demonstration of a basic capability we have already today.
Mike?
Thank you. That was a fascinating amount of detail. I try and draw distinction between scenarios for stress testing and scenarios, in this case, for transition planning for the banks. So my sense is you focus on stress testing of supply chains. How would you see that work translating into a bank developing its transition plan to the net zero economy?
Well, here I think the only methodological difference is for the stress testing, you need to come up with an agreement on how do you construct the scenario assumptions. Is, for example, an import ban to Europe part of the stress testing? Or what kind of carbon price do you choose for the stress testing? So that's then kind of a regulatory methodological issue. And a private company, for its investment calculus, has the freedom to go for any type of scenario to explore what their opportunity is. And then, then it goes also into kind of the maximization problem of profits under risks, on how you best evaluate your investment and your portfolio.
Super. Thanks very much, Michael. I think there's lots more that we can go into there, but we'll come back in the broader gap. Okay, so we're going to move across now to this second presentation, which is now looking at the other end of the spectrum, really, from the upstream supply chain. And with that, let me invite Dr. Mike Clark to take the stage.
Cheers. Thanks, Alex. Can everybody in the back hear me? Excellent. That's a first. So, yeah, as Alex said, I'll be taking more of a consumer lens and to contrast Michael, a bit more of a micro lens in terms of how consumer behavior can accelerate the shift towards net zero in the ag system. And so just with a little bit of background information, it's really important to point out that consumers right now are indicating that they do want to shift towards more sustainable food purchases. So in the UK, it's about 70% of consumers want to purchase lower impact foods. About 55 of those actually want to eat more sustainably. Major barriers to that are economic cost and perceived impact on health and other important outcomes such as economics. And at the same point, consumers also indicate that they want to consume healthy and nutritious foods. So there's a lot of indication in the UK and in similar countries such as US, Europe, so on, that consumers want to make these shifts towards more sustainable food purchasing behaviors. If you look at the information that we have right now, we have an abundance of eco-labels. And so in the marketplace, there's currently, at the last count, over 120 eco-labels on food products. And if you look at the information that these communicate, they're generally based on checkbox exercises where it's, does a producer do this? So do they use organic fertilizer? Do they rotate their cows on pastures in a sustainable way? But what they don't do is they don't communicate the actual impacts of the food. So it doesn't say, is this banana better than a different banana? Is this banana better than beef? Is this so on? So it doesn't allow comparability between individual products or cross-product types. So that means there's a really, really big information gap in terms of what consumers are saying they want to do and the information that's currently available for consumers to make on their food purchasing behavior. So what we've been doing for the last 3 or 4 years is trying to say, how can we overcome this information gap to incentivize consumer shifts towards more sustainable foods? And so in this process, what we've done is we've taken publicly available information on food packaging from major retailers, right now it's in the UK and Ireland, and said, how can we use this information to estimate the environmental impacts of different foods? And so what I'm going to show you in a second is a subset of this analysis. The entire analysis itself includes about 58,000 food products available in the UK marketplace. And what we're going to show right here is trade-offs between greenhouse gas emissions on the x-axis and biodiversity outcomes on the y-axis. So this is a snapshot about cookies and biscuits. So it's about 200 products currently available for purchase in the UK. And you can see 2 different results. So if you compare greenhouse gas outcomes to biodiversity outcomes, because again, as Michael was saying, we have 2 net zero transitions that we need to think about. There's generally a pretty strong correlation between products that have high impacts for biodiversity also have high impacts for climate, and products that have low impacts for one also have low impacts for the other. And from a consumer perspective, what that means is that if you want to eat your cookie, you can say, I can still eat a cookie, but I can eat one that's maybe slightly better for both outcomes. So it's not a huge dietary transition, but when scaled to the population, it can be very, very impactful. The second part from the producer and retailer side of things, you can start saying what ingredients, what commodities in these products are driving these high impacts. And so in the context of cookies and biscuits, it's chocolate, unfortunately, because it's delicious, as we all know. In the context of cookies and biscuits, it's having chocolate in the product is a very key determinant of a product having high impacts for both biodiversity and climate. And so from a retailer and manufacturer perspective, you can say, how can we source chocolate slightly better for our products so that those points move to the lower left? Or if you're a producer, you can start doing similar information as to what Michael was just doing in palm supply chains. The important thing is that, again, cycling back to what I was saying before, it's not just environment that consumers care about, it's environment and nutrition. And so this is looking at a slightly different snapshot. So it's the same analysis, but it's a slightly different snapshot comparing environmental outcomes on the y-axis versus nutrition outcomes on the x-axis. And so in this figure, it's a subset of about 600 sausages. And so essentially meat and meat alternatives available in the UK marketplace. And again, you can see 2 important points. The first is, again, that there's a correlation between environment and nutrition. So the lower left quadrant of this figure is more sustainable and more nutritious, and upper right is less sustainable and less nutritious. And so again, there's a tight correlation between products that are high impact for one outcome tend to have high impact for others. So what that means at a societal scale is that there doesn't necessarily have to be trade-offs between these outcomes that we care about. And the second one is, again, that if you start looking at the composition of these products, there are clear trends in terms of products that contain different types of meats, in this case, having high impacts, and products that generally contain smaller amounts of meat or poultry or entirely plant-based generally have lower impacts for both outcomes. So again, it's potentially useful for consumer perspectives, but also potentially useful for producer perspectives and retailer perspectives to say, how can this information influence our own behavior, either in supply chains or in terms of purchasing? The really important point to point out is it's also important to think about what's not being shown here. And so two aspects of this. It's one, consumer preferences generally skew towards things that are convenient, available, and tasty. And so in some cases, those are going to go antagonistic to these trends here. And the second one is also cost affordability, is that especially for meat and meat alternatives, many of the products in the lower left, so the meat alternatives, generally tend to be more expensive than meat itself. And so in terms of these transitions, that's a potential barrier. What we've done is we've taken that information and tested it in retail settings. And so this is a photo of eco-labels that we've developed and communicated to consumers in canteens. And we've done this in 3 or 4 different retail settings. And yeah, unfortunately, they're not super effective. There's no way around it. So when communicating this information to consumers, there tends to be about a 1 to 2% shift in the environmental impacts of the products purchased. So it's effective, but it really isn't that big of a lever. And the important thing to communicate is, again, it's just another source of evidence saying that we can't just think about this type of information communication, but we need to think about supply chains, we need to think about other levers that we can pull in the food system. The other one, too, that's important to point out in the context of eco-labels is that consumer choices do have capacity to permeate through supply chains. And so if you think about a very, very simplistic, admittedly simplistic theory of change, it's communicating this information. Consumers can say consumers want to eat lower impact foods. That then transitions into retailers producing or providing more amounts of these lower impact foods. You then have manufacturers starting to reformulate their products to not include high impact commodities. So in the examples that I showed, it would be maybe producing products that have slightly smaller amounts of meat or chocolate. And then it goes all the way to producers, where producers might start competing on their production systems to start producing their commodities more sustainably. And so even though we often view eco-labels as a consumer-oriented solution, they actually do have quite a large potential to permeate through supply chains. Yeah, thank you. Looking forward to questions and discussion later on.
Thanks very much, Mike. And you left yourself a few good minutes for questions. Can't just me who's interested in what the Krakowska sausage is all about, but anyway, let's see what, see what the room has to ask. If you could raise a hand, that would be great. Nick.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think we're good.
I just wanted to slightly question your final assumption, which is that the impact on the supply chain has to start with the consumer. I think our experience from product labeling, energy product labeling, is that actually it began largely with the retailer not wanting to have their products in a lower band. And actually, the idea that it was driven by consumers didn't seem to have much evidence to support it.
Okay, yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Could people in the back hear the question? Yeah, I can do that. So I can't switch slides. So going back to that simplistic theory of change, is that the question was saying, are we sure that consumers are driving the change, or are we sure that producers and manufacturers are driving the change? I think it's a really good point. So I was going to bring up that example. It's, if you look at energy labeling, there is essentially like a one-off change in consumer behaviors towards more energy efficient home appliances, and there is a much larger and longer trend towards producing, manufacturing more efficient home appliances. I imagine it's going to be similar in the food context from the eco-labeling that we found. And I think I would push back a little bit, saying it does come from both ends. Because unless there's consumers saying, I want to purchase different foods, which is going to have an economic impact to retailers and then manufacturers and potentially producers, that does provide some incentive, maybe not as large a producers doing something themselves, but it does provide some incentive for other actors in the supply chain to shift their behaviors.
Go back to the room. I'm just curious. Whether you, from your perspective, have any view on that, whether it's consumer push or producer push, just given where you sit?
Well, it's a good question. One comment I had actually on the pricing, I think Michael gave a bit of a benchmark and how much actually consumer is ready to pay up for sustainable products. And we did a survey on the cultured meat, kind of positioning cultured meat versus, for example, plant-based meat, which is already available, and kind of given that message that actually it's a guilt-free meat. We call it guilt-free because you don't slaughter the animals. And surprisingly, consumers are not ready to pay up. The premium they already pay for this kind of product was only 30-40%. We were expecting like at least 2 times, 3 times more, because obviously it will help, given the production itself right now is quite expensive. So yeah, that's the only comment I would have.
Okay, well, we'll have this is good because it gives us a bit more time to get into things at the end of the panels. So with that, we're going to move now actually to Azmat, who's going to give us his perspective, and this is a kind of led by the innovation and activity that's actually going on here in Oxfordshire. So Azmat, over to you. Azmat from Ivy Farm. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. So just quickly, as an intro, I'm a CFO in Ivy Farm. Joined the company last year from investment banking, where I was covering food tech, advising companies on various M&A, corporate finance transactions, M&A, IPOs, fundraising, etc. And alternative protein was part of my coverage there. So I was really excited about the space and actually think that out of 3 sub-verticals in the alternative protein, this technology probably has the most kind of big impact on the climate. So here at Ivy Farm, we are trying to create the best meat, but guilt-free. And obviously, it's a real meat. We don't use plant-based derivatives. And the idea is that people don't want to feel guilty when they eat meat. So we think people should be able to enjoy meat when they eat it. But there are 2 problems, right? One problem is people getting more and more concerned about climate impact of animal agriculture, traditional agriculture, and the second reason is people getting more and more kind of engaged into how the animals being harmed during factory farming. And obviously people don't want to feel guilty when they eat meat. So, but the problem is it's actually very difficult to replace meat, right? If you think about society, if you think about the social events, family events, gatherings, any food you think of contains meat. And we actually been serving ourselves, potential customers, but also there are quite a few services available. Only 25% of people actually enjoy kind of plant-based taste of a plant-based meat. And the second point here, 90% of the surveyed people find that it's very difficult to switch to plant-based alternatives. So basically the message here is plant-based meat hasn't really delivered on the promise. Maybe you guys already discussed it in the morning, but I was away. But obviously, net zero and meat, how big is the problem? And you probably know this already, but animal agriculture is responsible for 18%, I think, of the greenhouse gas emissions globally. In the UK, it's 10%, but still very significant number. What surprised me a lot is that actually animal agriculture is above all transport combined by greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a huge impact. Also, what's very interesting, the animal agriculture itself is a very inefficient way to produce calories. So it uses 80% of land, but at the same time, it delivers only at 18% of calories. So it's a very inefficient process. The story in the UK, as I mentioned, 10% of greenhouse gas emissions, and also we're depleting our land. UK is actually one of the worst countries in the world in terms of the biodiversity loss. 50% was lost already. On average, globally, it's only 25%, and some of the researchers think that it should be around 10% maximum. But what's interesting, recently I was going through climate change committee update, and they were basically saying that we need to change our diet. We need to reduce the consumption of meat. We need to reduce it by 35%. I think it was by 2040, as far as I remember. But if you look at the stats on the right-hand side, population will go up to 10 billion by 2050, and actually the demand on meat will increase by 70%. So there's no way we can achieve that. So basically, the bottom line is the food chain is really broken, and it's not only broken because of net zero targets, potential failure, but also because of the food farming, food safety risks, zoonotic diseases risks increases, antibiotic resistance, etc., etc. So the risks are really it's a long list, and that's where we come in play, where we coming in as a company. So that's our founder, co-founder Russ Tucker. Dr. Russ Tucker, actually, so he did PhD in Oxford University. So he's coming from the family of the butchers and farmers, and he obviously liked meat, always liked meat, but kind of felt always very guilty consuming meat, and kind of was thinking, how can he consume meat without actually feeling that guilt? And that's how Ivy Farm was founded. So that's basically how we're tackling the issue. So we're using really very deep science and technology to produce the meat, but what is more important, we are doing that much more efficiently than the traditional agriculture. So the way it actually works is very simple. So what we do, we take cells, stem cells, primary adult cells from the animal, and the vision is not to kill the animal. So it's a biopsy, it's a small chunk of tissue. And then we basically use enzymes, grow them, enzymes and then nutritionals obviously grow them in the bioreactors. And eventually you get a biomass, and then you can mix this biomass, both muscle, so we grow muscle cells and we grow fat cells. Then we can combine them and create mince, and then out of this mince we obviously can create delicious meat, which is real meat as a normal meat from the supermarket. But what is more important here is that the whole chain here, the production cycle is very short, so we can do that in 3 weeks. Versus if you look at animal agriculture, it sometimes takes up to 3 years to grow the animal. It can be a pig or it can be a cow. So it's obviously a long period of time. So we obviously kind of reduce impact on the planet. Because it's aseptic process, there is no risk of disease, potential disease or antibiotic resistance risks, not increasing. And also because we know exactly how much we want to grow, there's no waste in the cycle. But what exactly do we have? So that's kind of a quickly overview of the technology. So we have our own cell line, proprietary cell lines, which are immortal, and we have both for muscle and fat. We have developed our own formulations of culture media, i.e. basically nutritionals. We are feeding the cells. And these are all kind of, the media is serum-free, so we're not using animal-derived products. This is a big challenge for the industry to get rid of FBS, fetal bovine serum. So we have our own formulations without serum. Then obviously we have our own in-house processing team, so we're not outsourcing the processing itself to contractual companies. And we have our own pilot plant, actually here in Oxford. So we are based in Oxford Business Park, and the pilot plant is there. It's a 600-liter terminal bioreactor. Basically allows you to produce 200 kilos or so of meat per annum. It's obviously not assumed to be kind of for sale. It's more like a demonstration and creation of MVPs. But it's a big step and basically will allow us to prove that our process works end to end. But what is also important here is that all of these 4 parts of the business are encircled by 5 IPs we have around the 4 parts, and there is lots in pipeline. As I just mentioned before, so consumers obviously don't want to switch, right? They want to have a real meat. And I think this stats shows you quite well that I think it was A.T. Kearney who published the report saying that cultured meat will be potentially 35% of total meat consumed by 2040. But I was asked by Alex to come a bit with a kind of investments mindset, what is broken from kind of financing, from investment point of view. So a couple of kind of statistics here. So this is the total investments being raised by alternative protein space since 2016. It seems like it's a huge number, $12.5 billion in total across all 3 subsectors, plant-based, cultured meat and fermented meat. But as I will show you afterwards, it's actually a minuscule amount. But what is encouraging, some of the companies already raising big funding rounds. So you can see on the right-hand side there, some of the companies already raised up to 350 million per round, which is a relatively significant number. Oatly, for example, a plant-based milk company, they did 1.4 billion IPO a couple of years ago. So it's encouraging. What is important here that you can see the driver of investments growth in alternative protein. If you could look at the right-hand side pie, Cultured meat, which is a light gray segment, is already attracting almost a quarter of investments, and it's growing, right? So we started from 5% 2 years ago, and it's already half a quarter of the total investments, and plant-based obviously going down. And I think this is really proves my point that there's not enough investments being done in the alternative protein space. So if you look at the right-hand side chart here, this is a total investments attracted by electric vehicles sector. It's already $250 billion, and this is not counting the future investments, which are expected to be another $250 billion in the next 10 years. That's on the electric vehicle, and this is even not counting also the power stations infrastructure, which will attract another $500 billion. So all in all, $1 trillion will be invested into electric vehicles. And this is in comparison to alternative protein space, which attracts only $12.5 billion. Definitely minuscule. But if you look at the climate impact, both sectors are quite similar. So animal agriculture, 18% globally, greenhouse gas emissions, and transportation combined 14%. So why there is so less investments being done in alternative protein space? And I think the answer, there are twofolds in my mind. One is there is not enough government support. If you think about the electric vehicles, there's been a lot of tax breaks, for example, for electric vehicle companies, a lot of incentives for consumers to buy cars, electric cars. None of that was so far done around the alternative protein space. Also, regulatory-wise, alternative protein is really still very antiquated. The regulator is quite old, not modern, and can't move as fast. And also on the investment side, if you think about who has been invested so far in the space, predominantly equity investors, right? It's either sovereign wealth funds, family offices, some of agriculture VCs, but that's not enough. Obviously, there should be government involved, how it was done for electric vehicles in the past. It should be more project financing involved, which is kind of a very long-term capital, patient and long-term capital. And just kind of summarizing what can be done here. So one is what I mentioned, more investments, more instruments, more type of investments, not only equity, but also debt, project financing. The other thing, lots of corporates who have adjacent technologies who can help us to scale this, who can help us to reduce the costs, should be invested into the space. For example, we're using culture media, and basal media is part of the culture media. It's produced by lots of chemical companies, for example, like Merck. So they should be also invested into the space. And also from kind of route to market, partnering up with distributors, with retailers who can help us to bring the product to the consumer. Thank you, Alex.
Asma, thank you very much. Okay, so look, some diverse perspectives, I think. You'd agree in those three panelists so far. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to ask, in a second, I'm just going to ask each of you on the panel to maybe just give a few remarks, reflective remarks, on what's been discussed so far from your own perspectives, just to share that with the room. So if you can just be giving, the four of you could be giving that a little bit of thought for a second. And while you're doing that, maybe I can just open it up to the room for some questions. Yes, madam, over to you. Do you want to wait 1 second for the mic? Thanks, Patricia.
Hi, Catherine Hampton. I work for Schroeder's Wealth Management. I did a site visit a couple of weeks ago to a vertical farm, and they're only doing sort of leafy greens as of right now. But what they were talking about was that the future of where they want to take that technology is into kind of broader commodities, so soy, peas, wheat, rice, which would obviously massively change how we produce those commodities and the constraints on land. And I wanted to know from an academic and kind of scientific perspective, is that possible? You know, can we bring vertical farming to something beyond just kind of leafy greens and strawberries and blueberries, etc.?
Thanks very much. Michael and Mike, is that something you could comment on?
I think I'm relatively pragmatic. I don't see why it's not possible. I don't know how economically efficient it's going to be in the short term. from what I'm aware of, most vertical farming is either some type of aquaponics, so leafy greens with fish underneath them, or leafy greens with fish underneath them, or just leafy greens by itself. There's probably a way to do something else, but haven't seen it yet.
The economic calculations, even with more advanced philosophy, it's not viable at the moment, but you should never discard an option.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Anything else from the room? Okay, so just while you're... Oh, I'm sorry, at the back. Thanks, Justin.
Really interesting seeing that new business. You showed a slide early on about customer acceptance and whether they're willing to pay a premium. But what is the customer acceptance of cultured meat overall? Because obviously, I can imagine some people just are going to still be turned off by that. It sort of falls somewhere between the plant-based vegetarian movement, which has driven so much, and the traditional agriculture. So I just wonder what you're learning from consumer feedback.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, we actually did the survey ourselves. In the UK, I think up to 80% were keen, very keen, or moderately keen to try cultured meat. But it varies quite a lot across geographies. There are quite a few studies. I think US is quite progressive, especially if you go from state to state. For example, you go to West Coast, obviously very receptive. Very receptive also in China, surprisingly, because obviously the proteins are on the rise there. It's growing, the consumption is growing very fast, and they don't make a big fuss from the way where it comes from. I think Europe is relatively conservative. I don't remember exactly the number, but I think it's probably up to 50% who were kind of keen to try it. But again, I think the perception is that what we need to change, people don't understand really what is cultured meat. They think it's a fake meat. Someone was even called it Frankenstein type of meat. But actually, it's the same meat. It's just produced differently, right? You don't need to grow the animal. It's very inefficient biosystem if you think about the animal. Only 60% of the body is actually edible by humans, right? The rest is waste. It's very, very unsustainable. Just because it was kind of natural done like that, it doesn't mean it should be continue to go like that.
Hi, Sharifa here. Have you had any view about whether that type of meat is accepted by the Muslim community? Do they see it as halal?
Yeah, great question. Because we actually started from pork. The company started back in 2019 as a spin-off from University of Oxford, actually. But from this year, we started developing our bovine lines as well, beef. And one of the reasons was that quite a few Middle Eastern investors were keen to invest and actually roll it out in Middle East. But obviously, they need halal meat. And there's a lot of scientists already thinking, and religious people who are thinking how it actually should be produced. Starting not only from how do you get the cells from the animal, but actually how you grow the cells in the labs. For example, your lab should be separated from the pork lab, as an example, right? But obviously coming back also to the animal, how the animal was slaughtered, if it was slaughtered, how it was treated. But that's definitely now a pipeline, because basically what we have done so far, we have developed pretty much a platform. We can immortalize the cell lines in different species in the same way we've done it for pork. So the plan is now to do that for bovine. But to create a halal or kosher, it's kind of technicalities. There's obviously a bit more infrastructure needed to kind of comply with the rules. But it shouldn't be an issue. And when we talk to religious, people, they didn't have any issue with just the concept. It's just the question of how we actually source the cells and how we grow them.
Interesting question, thank you. Anything else burning from the room? Okay, so just while people are thinking, can I please just turn it back? So it's just when we'll go with you first, Michael Urban, if that's okay. Any reflections on thoughts on what's come before?
Maybe a quick reaction on the government subsidies question, because what is very interesting with agriculture is that it is actually a very heavily subsidized sector. Right? We're talking about 500 to 700 billions in either through market distortions and policies or direct producer subsidies. And so if we think about currently the structure of those subsidies and the fact that they're actually fairly misaligned with government's own objectives when it comes to climate, when it comes to biodiversity, also when it comes to the public health issues that have been highlighted earlier, there's actually quite a lot of potential to repurpose public monies for the transition. That's hopefully a cause for optimism.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Professor Michael Obistina.
I think what we learned here is that the agricultural sector, the land use sector, is really far behind what we see in the energy sector. And of course, you always start with the low-hanging fruit, and this was energy. And as I said before, it's much easier to regulate a few power plants than masses of people. What's really scary in a way about the land use sector is that there's so many people involved in it. So it's a really sticky, really hard to abate problem. And we have technological solutions. However, there are so many social problems associated with it. So for example, if ivory farm is super successful, then all in a sudden you have, especially in developing countries, major unemployment if this were a breakthrough technology and everyone would eat this kind of meat. So here we are talking really large amounts of people affected, not only for the eating habits, but also for the very basic employment. And so regulating or getting this sector to shift, it's not only technology, finance, it's very much a social problem. Right. And this is very difficult to attack. So here, this really must go hand in hand with very proactive governmental policies, starting from education and all of these kind of things. All the way to what you guys are discussing in finance and private sector activity. So here this is even more partnership, and even I'm more on the economic side, but I think here really the word planning needs to come in, because many things are actually predictable in this sector.
Yeah, no, thank you, Michael, for that important framing. Mike Clark.
Yeah, thank you. So I think 3 key points. The Michaels to my left have said 2 of them, so I'll make a shorter list of the other ones. I think 1, just really from the beginning, we need to be aware of the urgency that we have in terms of food systems and climate and biodiversity. There's a lot of evidence that Michael's produced and other people here at Oxford or just in the UK or in the world have produced that says that if we don't do anything with food systems and we do everything else perfectly, so energy perfectly, transportation perfectly, we're missing climate targets in 30 years, we're missing biodiversity targets in 30 years. And so that's kind of the starting point where we're going to. It's if we don't do food, we're really going to be in a bad place. From the 3 presentations so far, there's opportunity to attack this from multiple directions. So it's supply chains, consumers, and production through technology. And we need to do all of those, and we need to do all of those really rapidly. The last point is that the barriers to doing these transitions are really quite large. There's economic barriers, there's financial barriers, and as Michael said, there are really big social and cultural barriers. And some of the transitions that we're talking about right now, so eating entirely plant-based diets or mostly plant-based diets or reducing food loss and waste has, as Michael was saying, potentially very large knock-on impacts to individuals that we can't ignore. So when we're talking about these changes in the food system, we have to be really urgent, attack it from multiple directions, but we can't ignore the people that will be affected in both positive ways and negative ways.
Yeah. Yes, of course, Michael.
One issue when you look at the 1.5 degree scenario, so by 2050 we go net negative, and then we go negative for the next, well, actually in these scenarios to 2100. But the longer-term scenarios suggest that we will have to live with a net negative economy for at least the next 300 years. And in all of these scenarios, it's the wonder technology, bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration, which is a land use technology, saves us to get to the 1.5 degrees. So if we don't get good news from direct air capture and we don't solve the land use problem, then we need to say goodbye to 1.5 for sure.
And Azamat, is there any remarks you have to make?
No, I learned a lot, to be honest, guys. But my only remark is I think we all realize there is a problem. I think there is not enough focus on animal agriculture. Everyone was super focused on energy and transport. And I think what is missing is Elon Musk effect, right, in the industry. Because there was one guy who basically pushed it through, and then suddenly everyone in the industry follows him. Similar thing is not happening around animal agriculture, for example, or alternative protein space. We see good signs, and again, the good signs as usual, and I'm really it's a shame I'm saying that, but it comes from US, it comes from Israel, but Europe is always lagging, UK is always lagging because, and again, I'm coming from investments appetite perspective. We're so conservative here, we don't believe, we want to follow. We want to see first that should happen in the US or whatever, maybe in Asia nowadays, before Europe will realize, well, actually, this problem can be solved.
Yeah, interesting point. And what an Elon Musk for the food system is that the solution? Let's one more time to the room before I invite Michael to speak. Yes, please, madam. Thank you. If you give 1 second, there's a mic coming down to you. And did I miss another hand while I was looking there? Oh, there's one in the back. We'll go down and then back up to you if that's all right. Just the lady the lady in black.
Yeah, my name's Jill Schenkelman. I just want to slightly challenge the picture that is coming out from the panel. Not at all about the scale of the problem, but I do think Europe is behind. And there are really some important advances in at least making large-scale ag more sustainable by using precision systems, by using technology, by using information. And I'd like to ask the panel's view on if we could find a way of channeling more finance into that transition, it won't solve the problem, but it will go a long way to reducing the burden that the ag sector puts on the environment.
Sorry, so the question is challenging more finance into technologies like precision agriculture?
Do the panel consider that channeling more finance to those things like high precision ag, using technology and data so you're reducing the use of inputs, you're reducing the use of water, is that worth doing? And if so, how do we get the finance there?
Right. Michael, you're probably going to talk about this in a second, I expect. So if you don't mind, I'll let you hold fire. This is actually fittingly part of the final speaker's speech, but please.
Yeah. So if there were no subsidies, that's exactly what we would see. Yeah. Because large-scale agriculture is actually the most cost-efficient way to do it. It would have massive land saving. So the calculations are something like 50% of cropland could be spared if you really go for maximum yield agriculture, which would give a lot of land to biodiversity and others. Of course, you would mess up locally a little more, which is probably not negligible. But I would like to come back to these social consequences. And in order to do this, our calculations are basically, you can do this with 20 million farmers, and we have 1 billion. And so in this transition phase, we need to it's a labor market issue. We need to get these kind of labor resources into other sectors of the economy. And for this, we need some planning, education and all of these kind of things. So if we go for this, it would make a lot of sense. However, we need to do this in an orderly fashion.
Do you have a response to that?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Anything to say, Michael? Or should I? Yeah.
No. It's happening. We're seeing it.
Yeah. Sorry, Mike. Yeah.
Yeah, I can talk about one of our good colleagues, Joseph Hoare, is doing work on big data and agricultural systems. So the premise of what he's doing is he's essentially giving phone apps to producers. Right now, there are trials in wheat and I believe maize in Europe and Southeast Asia. And the premise behind it is saying, how can you communicate information to producers on opportunities for them to produce more efficiently, both economically and sustainably? And how do producers respond to it? The results aren't back yet, so the trial's in progress. But yeah, there are definitely people exploring that, and I think it's a really big opportunity that could potentially be leveraged.
Thanks, Mike. Justin at the back, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm so pleased we're having this discussion. I wonder, though, what you think of the mobilization, or what role payment for ecosystem services of one kind and another need to play for the many hundreds of thousands of farmers, smallholders that are going to be displaced if we move to an entire cultured meat protein sector and large-scale mechanization of agriculture. And so sort of, is that a key part of what it is? Because most farmers that you ever speak to really take their stewardship of the land very seriously. They want to continue to produce food, but also we're asking them to deliver more environmental services, but without actually the mechanisms or payments to do that. So I just wonder how you think about balancing that and then unintended consequences of technology and land, because it hasn't gone well for the land and many people living on the land over the last 1,000 years or so. So how can we also ensure that increased use, and this is not an anti-technology statement, but just really thinking through how we actually fundamentally alter our relationship with land to be much more in balance moving forward.
Yeah, great question. Thanks. Michael O, do you mind having a first go at that? I think this is an area that you're an expert in.
Yeah, well, here, this goes very much into this debate which we have, which is called land sparing and land sharing. And you know, the agro-industrial paradigm goes into the land sparing issue, where you actually produce highly efficient on much less land. And if you were to go into this direction, so the agricultural policy needs to go together with the ecosystem payment policy as well. And if you go into this way, into this direction, then you would see that the large-scale farmers, and then on the kind of spared land, which you could buy relatively cheaply, you would actually then put in the ecosystem service payments for rewilding, reforestation, and whatnot. So this would actually play out spatially, completely different. However, if the agricultural policies and also how do you deal with the smallholders, then you will see a completely different picture. So it's really the micro design of the policy coordinated, of the ecosystem service policy coordinated with the agricultural policy, and given how the technologies play out on the competing side, will actually geospatially play out in geographic manifestations. So here we need to, on our side, on the academic side, but also on the policy-making side, we need to do the proper analysis and come up with mechanism designs such that we actually push the sector and the landscapes into the right direction we want to have it, with proper design of the ecosystem services. So this sounds a little abstract, but it's, for me, this is an economic design question.
Well, thank you for that very clear and comprehensive answer to that, Michael. Okay, we're going to move on to the final panel. This is a financially literate audience, I'm told. Well, I can see. Should say that. And so it seems fitting that we should end with Dr. Michael Urban, who's going to tell us a little bit about his perspective on these issues and that of his firm. So, Michael, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex. So, first of all, I hope you'll forgive me, because I'll do a bit of. There's an element of repetition with what I'll start my presentation with, but hopefully it helps sort of summarizing at a macro level some of the things that have been already said. The three, I guess, key takeaways for this presentation is, first of all, is to offer a land systems perspective on net zero transition in agriculture in particular, and maybe broaden the scope a little bit, go beyond the question of carbon, greenhouse gas emissions, thinking about other Earth systems. Then it's to introduce the idea that actually land restoration commitments and projects could actually be a major catalyst for the transition to new food systems and food systems that are aligned with Earth systems and planetary boundaries. And the third point is to offer a bit of perspective on how we see the investment opportunities related to that transition. So just starting with this land systems perspective, you'll recognize a number of those statistics. This is just to say, we've had the previous panel was focused on energy for very good reasons when we're talking about decarbonization, the race to net zero. Actually, when we look at agriculture, forestry, and other land use as a system, it is overall a primary driver of planetary boundaries transgression across the spectrum of those different Earth systems, and is actually very consequential to the net zero question as well. This is 24% of greenhouse gas emissions. As was said previously, if you expand that to the whole of food systems, you're probably looking at around a third of greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, when we think about the race to net zero, the amount of commitments, especially coming from financial institutions, a lot of conversation happening around energy, perhaps a little less around food systems. And of course, all of these other elements which have already been stressed. Now, the question is, how did we get there? And here, I think having a kind of helicopter view, this is coming from the UK National Food Strategy, helicopter view on our relationship to land and where agriculture actually fits into that equation. Effectively about 50%, again, a statistic that was shared earlier, but I think it's important to emphasize, 50% of all habitable land is currently used for agriculture. And what happens is, as agricultural land expands to the right-hand side, we have forest degradation. As forests get degraded, we also have biodiversity loss because, of course, it's encroaching on the natural habitat of many species, and we lose a natural carbon sink, which is also a cause of climate change. Now, if we look at a level further down and we look at agricultural practices, how agriculture is actually performed, well, it is still overwhelmingly conventional, industrial-intensive farming. And that means through tilling, amongst other things, carbon that's sequestered in the soil gets released, causing or having further of a negative impact on climate change. But there's also, of course, the aspect of agrochemical pollution, thinking about the use of fertilizers, which are still predominantly produced out of fossil fuels, more negative consequences and impact on climate change, but also the overuse of pesticides alongside of fertilizers that run off in waterways. And then the last part, and I'll come back to this because this is to the point about, I guess, the inefficiency and the meat and dairy question. Actually, 80% of that agricultural land, or close to 80%, is currently used to produce meat and dairy. And of course, a lot of that comes from the crops that we use to feed livestock. That is incredibly water intensive. It also causes more climate change because those livestock release methane, amongst other gases. So the question is, what is the kind of macro solution? And it very likely boils down to something that is seemingly quite simple, which is about returning agricultural land back to nature. And here we're talking about 1 billion hectares of land. This is just about the size of China, being returned back to nature. Now, if you think about the challenge of having to feed an ever-growing population, could grow by up to 25% with 20% less land, you start running into some troubles if you think about doing more of the same thing and just relying on more and more intensive agricultural practices and just expect that you can improve yields, which is unlikely. And what is possibly a good news about this, and that this is not just sort of wishful thinking about what needs to happen for the environment, but it is also something that is backed by country-level targets in terms of returning land back to nature through pledges either on climate or biodiversity. And actually a pretty substantive chunk of that land, being pledged for major agricultural producers. So that, we think, is likely to be a major catalyst for the transformation of food systems. You'll recognize again some of those statistics. I'm not going to get into too much detail, but this is just to highlight how incredibly inefficient our current food system is, right? We're talking about using 80% of all agricultural land to only get about 20% of our calories. And actually, even on the protein question, which comes up regularly when we discuss this question of meat and dairy, we actually only get less than 40%. Huge amount of waste along the food supply chain. Only, well, about 30% of all foods produced never actually get consumed. And then there's further issues around resilience, and that's sort of thinking about the supply chain issues. There was, again, a discussion around the invasion of Ukraine in relation to the energy transition earlier. This was, of course, very consequential to food systems as well. There's, the question of climate change, which is going to be enormously consequential. And finally, the question of the quality of diets and nutrition, back to those agricultural subsidies and governments in at least many nations sort of struggling with public health issues, being in a position of potentially repurposing some of those subsidies to have, as was highlighted earlier, there's a nice sort of combination between what's probably good for planetary boundaries, for the planet, is also very probably quite good from a health standpoint when we talk about the transition in terms of diets. So ultimately, we'd summarize the pathway at a very high level on sort of happening across four building blocks. And that's effectively about producing different types of foods. And here we're talking about producing more nutritious, probably overwhelmingly plant-based foods. There's this idea of producing foods for different species, cutting out the middle cow, this very inefficient intermediation system. Producing foods differently, and I think this is back to your point, and there's actually a lot of potential to combine ancestral regenerative agricultural practices with also what the 21st century has to offer in precision agriculture, technological solutions, and finally, better distribution system to cut out the waste problem. Now, what does that mean in terms of an investment case and whether there are actually significant opportunities related to that transformation? So we think about it as, again, keeping that food systems perspective as basically unfolding through three major themes. So you'll recognize basically a breakdown of the value chain, the production side, the consumption side, but also a cross-cutting theme in the middle with enabling solutions. On the production side, you'll have opportunities which help basically stepping away from land-based protein production, aquaculture, non-fed aquaculture in particular. There's probably some space still for animal feed and health, but for a much smaller and cleaner cohort. In the fertilizer space, much earlier days, and we'll get back to this in terms of the evolution along that S-curve that Mattia was referring to earlier. And then on the consumption side, of course, I think it's interesting actually if you think about the evolution of the average restaurant menu or the average supermarket aisle over the last 5 to 10 years in the UK, but in other countries as well, and how quickly that is progressing. That basically, I think, tells a story in terms of the opportunity set in food manufacturing, but also for retailers, restaurants as well. And then in the middle, those enabling solutions, some related to the logistics and the delivery, helping cut back on the waste with packaging solutions, but also some opportunities related to tech, sort of broadly defined, in precision ag in particular. So overall, and I'm not going to get into the details of all of those numbers, but we sort of view the opportunity set as in the size of the market in revenue terms by 2030 of new food systems to reach around 1.5 trillion US dollars. That is from a starting point of around 650 billion today. And so you can start sort of seeing, it's not exhaustive, but you can start seeing some of those individual solutions fitting along that breakdown I was just showing you earlier. Huge organic food and beverage market, probably close to 600 billion. Plant-based meat, plant-based dairy together, probably being close to 200 billion by 2030. And some smaller markets, but also probably some very high growth, high double-digit growth in the tech space, thinking of a variety of applications in precision agriculture, amongst other things, back to geospatial, some very interesting opportunities related to enabling making better farming decisions. So how do we think about this from an investor standpoint? Well, basically, we think that the transition is going to unfold at different sort of speed and different stages as well through time along that S-curve. And the reality is some of those solutions are still very early stage, others are quite mature. For us, I guess the key part as investors is to understand when we think there's a high probability that a solution will reach an inflection point, as in transition from niche to mass market, where you start having that exponential growth, which should be reflected in here equity valuation if we're thinking about equity as an asset class. So just to give you a bit of a flavor on where some of those individual solutions lie on that S-curve, basically some markets actually already fairly mature, quite established, probably true for non-fed aquaculture. Some of those markets, I think back to my points about how quickly supermarket aisles or restaurants' menus are evolving, I think tells a story about where plant-based in particular lies on that sort of exponential part of this S-curve, very much becoming a mass market and growing quite rapidly, but also some much earlier stage innovation. Here I'm thinking about, well, cultivated meat for one, but also green ammonia for the fertilizer market, which is a pretty sizable market, around 180 billion, as I was saying earlier, very much still dominated by fossil fuels. And that's it. I'll stop here.
Thanks very much, Michael. Those are some really good-looking slides as well, I must say.
Thank you.
And actually, thank you very much for sort of you brought a lot of stuff together, and then actually gave some narrative to the whole. I'd like to say it was all by design, probably by your design, if not mine. But great to have that. Okay, so we have a few minutes for any specific questions around the investment case and that final piece. Yes, sir. Just at the back. Patricia, do you want to have a go at just shouting it out? I think.
Yeah, I can just call out. There's a couple of things that came out of that. One is on the share price investment. There wasn't actually any land-based investments in there, but I thought it raised an interesting public policy point nonetheless. In that, is it acceptable to the public and governments for people to be making what could be seen as large profits out of this transition from traditional landscapes to very different land economics?
Thank you. That's an interesting. Did you catch all of that, Michael? Which is this idea of, I guess, the socializing, the privatization of the profit associated with the transition. Oh, not quite. But.
So yeah, I mean, is it a question about is this a problem, or as in you find it problematic that the transition unlocks opportunities and some investors would profit from it, or did I not understand the question correctly? Well, I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack, right? But generally speaking, if in a capitalist economy, if the way to deploy capital at scale to enable having solutions in this space to address, I guess, well, the broad range of issues that we've just discussed is about generating a return on investment, it's part of the incentive structure. I mean, you can extend that argument beyond the question of the net zero transition in agriculture to energy, to any other sector. Not to say it's not something worth being debated, but yeah. It's structurally, I suppose, the way it is.
I'm sure Azmat would agree with that. I mean, if Ivy Farm couldn't make a profit, then that sort of technological transition would probably be challenging to make, right?
The question is also who is profiting from this, right? Because, for example, for us, the approach is we can go ourselves, B2B, B2C, we produce our own raw ingredients, right? But we could also license out the technology to some of the traditional meat processes, for example. Lots of companies already, like Tyson, already invest into the space, and they will be creating those profits. It doesn't mean they are... Basically, if you look at traditional agriculture, because it's commoditized, the profits are disappearing, right? Because you see lots of competition from emerging markets, for example, where labor is cheap. And that's actually to the previous points around, if you look at the UK actually imports 6 billion of meat. And where these imports are coming from, it comes from emerging markets where standards might be lower, right, of animal agriculture. So I think as long as kind of it's like a zero-sum game, right? So I think the profits are created. Profits are created for existing players as well. New labor, new positions are created, right, in the company. So it's actually a win-win situation in my mind.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Is there a comeback on that, or can I? Okay, thank you. And any other questions from the financial audience? It's pretty quiet at 6 o'clock, and I think we can all understand that. Well, I'm not going to beat a horse. I'm going to invite anyone on the panel who'd like to make a final intervention to do so, and seeing nobody rushing. Oh, Azmat.
No, just the last one. Comment on the subsidies from the previous panel.
Yeah.
Example is, if you look at the US again, there is a very strong meat lobby. At the same time, lots of subsidies, but you can see lots of cultured meat companies growing there quite successfully, raising funds. And there are two forces, right? One is kind of traditional, coming from the governments with subsidies, with traditional players, but also from investors who are really risk takers, right? And that's what I'm not seeing, for example, here in Europe, where we still have lots of subsidies, but we're not feeling that pull from investors that we need to change. Because I think, again, in my mind, investors don't understand that there is climate risk, which is real, and it impacts the investment risk as well. So investors will see their returns come down in decades from now, because it impacts lots of other sectors where they invested already.
Yeah, it's a really great point. And I think these socio-political as well as financial dimensions to this narrative are really important to kind of explore. So thank you for that. Michael.
Well, just probably an attempt for a final word. And this is, agriculture is one of the most undercapitalized sectors in most economies. And if we were able to capitalize properly, we would see a lot of these, what we had before, this kind of land-sparing agriculture. And this would for sure solve the environmental problem. And I would say that's actually necessary. So your success is actually then the success of the planet. What we need to do is we need to put these social safeguards in, and that's really more on the governmental level rather than a finance sector problem.
Yeah. Super point to finish with. Well, look, my thanks to the panel for a really engaging session. Can we join me in thanking you two?